They whispered about her clothes, mocked. They whispered about her clothes, mocked her accent, questioned her past, and spent 3 years making her feel like she didn't belong at their table. They called themselves a distinguished family. They called her nothing. What they never bothered to find out, what their arrogance made them too blind to ask, was who, exactly, was watching over her. And when they finally found out, it was already too late. The Ashford estate in Wiltshire sat behind iron gates and a half-mile gravel driveway lined with oak trees, so old they had names. The house itself, a Georgian manor that had appeared in 2 separate architectural magazines, and 1 BBC documentary about English country homes, was the kind of place designed to make you feel small the moment you stepped inside it. Sophie Brennan arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October 2019, the sky the colour of pewter, the air smelling of wet grass and chimney smoke. She was 27 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a low knot, wearing a cream wool coat that had belonged to her late mother. She carried 1 suitcase, a canvas bag, and a small potted rosemary plant she'd brought as a housewarming gift. Daniel Ashford had warned her. Not bluntly, Daniel was never blunt about anything involving his family, but in the careful, cushioning way he had of preparing her for difficult things. "My mother has very specific ideas about people," he had said during the drive from London. "Just give her time. She warms up. Eventually." Sophie had squeezed his hand and said, "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here because you asked me to move in. And I love you." She meant it. That was the thing about Sophie Brennan, that the Ashford family would spend the next 3 years completely failing to understand. She was exactly what she appeared to be. No performance, no angle, no agenda. Daniel Ashford was 31. The youngest partner at Ashford and Callaway Capital, a private equity firm his grandfather had founded in the 1960s. He was handsome in a tired sort of way, with good manners and a genuine laugh, and a blind spot the size of a continent when it came to his mother. His name, his education, his connections, all of it had been handed to him in an orderly fashion since birth. And he accepted these gifts the way people accept oxygen without thinking too much about it. His mother, Patricia Ashford, met Sophie at the front door. She was 63, immaculately dressed in a navy blazer and cream slacks, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and eyes the colour of shallow water. She looked at Sophie the way a surgeon looks at a patient chart, quickly, clinically, already forming a prognosis. "Sophie," she said, not as a greeting but as a categorization. "Mrs. Ashford." Sophie extended the rosemary plant. "I brought this for the kitchen garden, if you'd like it." Patricia looked at the plant. She did not take it. "How thoughtful," she said, the words carrying no warmth whatsoever, and stepped back to allow Sophie inside. That was the first moment. Looking back later, Sophie would identify it as the exact second the war began, though at the time. She thought it was just nerves. She thought Patricia was one of those women who needed time. She thought kindness and patience would eventually open a door. She was wrong. There was no door. There was a wall, and behind it, a woman who had already decided. Daniel's older sister, Charlotte Ashford, arrived for dinner that evening with her husband. Geoffrey Crane, a mergers attorney whose handshake was firm and whose eyes were never quite warm, and their 2 teenage children. Charlotte was 44, refined in the brittle way of women who have worked very hard to appear effortless. She had attended Oxford, married well, sat on 2 charitable boards, and considered herself a fine judge of character. Her judgment of Sophie was delivered to Geoffrey in a whispered conversation outside the dining room, which Sophie overheard quite clearly from the hallway because the house's acoustics were exceptional. "She's pretty enough," Charlotte said, "but she's nobody. Geoffrey, absolutely nobody. Some girl from Cork with a dead mother and no family money. Daniel could have had anyone." "He seems happy," Geoffrey said. "He seems distracted," Charlotte replied, which is not the same thing. Sophie stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the rosemary plant, which nobody had taken from her hands all evening. Then she quietly walked back to the kitchen, found a windowsill in the sunlight, and set it down herself. She said nothing about what she'd heard. Not to Daniel, not to anyone. She filed it in the part of herself where she put things she didn't have time for. And she went to dinner and was gracious and funny and genuinely interested in everyone at the table, including Charlotte, who spoke to her as though she were staff. What people don't understand about sustained cruelty within a family is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It builds, brick by brick, in small, deliberate gestures that can each be explained away individually, but together form something suffocating. Patricia Ashford was a master of the small gesture. She would send group text messages about family events and forget to include Sophie. When Sophie brought it up gently, Patricia would say, "Oh, I thought Daniel would have told you." She would set the dinner table with 6 place settings when there were 7 people eating. Then notice the error with a soft, "Oh, goodness," that somehow always felt rehearsed. At Christmas 2019, she gave every person in the family a thoughtful, personalized gift, a first edition for Charlotte, cufflinks engraved with initials for Geoffrey, art supplies for the grandchildren, a cashmere scarf for Daniel, and handed Sophie a generic gift basket from Fortnum and Mason that still had the price tag on it. "I didn't quite know what you liked yet," Patricia said pleasantly. "We're still getting to know each other." By Christmas 2021, 2 years in, Patricia still didn't know what Sophie liked. She had never asked. Charlotte was more direct in her cruelties. She had developed a habit of referring to Sophie's opinions in conversation as sweet, a word she deployed like a small knife. "That's a sweet idea," she'd say when Sophie suggested something at dinner, or, "How sweet that she thinks that." To Geoffrey, while Sophie was in the same room, she questioned Sophie's career. Sophie was a textile conservator, restoring antique fabrics for museums and private collections, with a barely disguised contempt that dressed itself as curiosity. "But is there actually money in that?" Charlotte asked once, in front of the entire family. "I mean, is it a real profession, or is it more of a hobby?" Daniel's uncle, Robert Ashford, who appeared at family gatherings like a bad weather system, once asked Sophie directly at a Boxing Day lunch how she and Daniel had met. When Sophie explained they'd met at a gallery opening in London, Robert had nodded slowly and said, "A gallery opening? Right. And you were there as a guest." The implication was clear. Sophie had smiled, picked up her wine glass, and said, "I was there as a friend of the curator, actually. I'd helped restore 2 of the pieces on exhibition." Then she turned to the person beside her and changed the subject. She did not make scenes. She did not retaliate. She did not cry in front of them. This restraint was sometimes mistaken for weakness, which suited her fine. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, because they'd already decided who she was the life Sophie led outside the walls of the Ashford estate. They didn't know about the phone calls she received from museum directors in Paris and Florence, They didn't know she'd spent 8 months in her 20s working under Dr. Margarethe Vonk at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, one of the most respected textile conservators in Europe. They didn't know about the letters she received from institutions they had framed photographs with on their own walls. They didn't know about Lord Henry Beaumont. Lord Henry Beaumont was 71 years old, a former diplomat who had served in Brussels, Washington, and Nairobi over a 4-decade career in the British Foreign Office. He was the kind of man whose name opened rooms that most people didn't know existed, a man who had lunch with cabinet ministers on a Tuesday and attended private evening concerts at Windsor on a Saturday without remarking on either. He was also Sophie Brennan's godfather. This was not a piece of information Sophie volunteered, not because she was hiding it. She wasn't the hiding sort, but because it had simply never come up in a way that felt natural. Lord Beaumont had been her mother's closest friend since their university days at Trinity College, Dublin, a friendship that had lasted 40 years, through marriages and moves and grief and celebration. When Sophie's mother, Ewythe Brennan, had died of cancer in 2015, she had left Sophie 2 things: the cream wool coat and a letter to Henry that said, simply, "She is yours to watch over now." You know what that means. Henry Beaumont had taken that responsibility with the same quiet seriousness with which he had approached everything in his life. He called Sophie every Sunday at 11 in the morning. He attended her exhibition openings. He had flown to Amsterdam when she was struggling, sat with her in a cafe for 3 hours, and said very little except the right things at exactly the right moments. When she'd started seeing Daniel, he had listened to her talk about him for 45 minutes before saying, "He sounds like a good man who loves you. That matters. But remember that people's families are not incidental. They are structural. Pay attention." She had paid attention. What she found had worried her but not deterred her, because Daniel himself was, as Lord Beaumont had assessed, a genuinely good man. A flawed one, certainly too deferential to his mother, too conflict-averse, too unwilling to name what was happening in his own home, but fundamentally decent, and fundamentally in love with her. Lord Beaumont had also met Daniel once, briefly, at an opening in London in early 2020. Daniel had not known who he was. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes about restoration ethics and climate effects on antique textiles, because Henry Beaumont was the kind of man who could speak with genuine knowledge about almost anything. Afterward, Henry had told Sophie, "He has no idea you know me, and I'd keep it that way for now, if I were you. It's useful to know what people are like when they're not trying to impress anyone." Sophie had kept it that way. For 3 years, she had kept it that way. But Lord Henry Beaumont had not been keeping quiet. It happened in February 2022 on a Saturday evening, during what the Ashford family called a small dinner, which meant 12 people, a professionally catered 3-course meal, and wine that cost more than Sophie's monthly rent had been before she moved to Wiltshire. The occasion was Patricia Ashford's 65th birthday. Sophie had spent 2 weeks planning a gift, a piece of antique needlework she had spent her own evenings conserving and framing, a piece she knew, from a conversation 18 months earlier, that Patricia had admired at an auction but hadn't bid on. Sophie had tracked it down through a dealer in Edinburgh, negotiated for it privately, and spent 3 weekends painstakingly restoring a damaged corner of the linen backing. It had cost her £1,400 and considerable personal time. Patricia opened it, looked at it, said, "Oh," in a tone that was neither pleased nor displeased, and set it against the leg of the table. where it remained for the rest of the evening. Charlotte gave her mother a weekend in Florence, with a suite at the Sant, Regis and tickets to a private museum tour. Patricia held the envelope to her chest and said, "You always know exactly what I need." Sophie watched this and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in that house, not hurt. Exactly. But something adjacent to it, a kind of tired. The real moment came later, after the pudding had been cleared and the port had come out. The men had drifted to the other end of the room, and Sophie was sitting near the window with Charlotte and two of Patricia's friends, a woman named Diane Hargreaves, whose husband was in property development, and another named Rosalind Fleet, who Sophie had never particularly warmed to. The conversation had moved to the subject of the estate specifically. The question of whether Patricia ought to consider moving to a smaller property now that the children were grown. Charlotte made the case for a well-managed cottage on the grounds. Patricia deflected it gracefully. Then Rosalind, who had drunk quite a lot of port, said something that changed the entire evening. "Well," Rosalind said, looking directly at Sophie with a smile that was not a smile, "at least you don't have to worry about what Daniel's wife would want, since there isn't one." The table went still. "I just mean," Rosalind continued, with the particular bravery of the well-fortified, "that until Daniel makes things official, these are really family decisions. Family decisions." She repeated the word the second time, more slowly, as though Sophie might have missed the point. Sophie set down her glass. She looked at Rosalind Fleet with an expression so calm it was almost clinical. "That's an interesting view," Sophie said. "I'll keep it in mind." Then Charlotte, and this was the part that made it unforgivable, because Charlotte was not drunk, not inarticulate, not unaware of what she was doing. Charlotte smiled and said, "Rosalind's not wrong. Darling, it's just the reality of these things. Some relationships are very meaningful, but aren't necessarily permanent." The word "darling" was the worst part. Sophie excused herself from the table. She walked through the hall, through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the garden, where she stood in the February cold for several minutes, her arms folded, her breath visible in the dark air. She did not cry. She took out her phone, and she called Lord Henry Beaumont. He answered on the second ring, as he always did. "Sophie, Henry," she said, "I think it's time." There was a pause. She could hear him in whatever room he was in his study. "Probably. The one with the view of the Thames. Tell me what happened." She told him. She told him everything, not just the evening, but the 3 years. She told him about the gift baskets and the missing place settings, and the word "sweet," and the question about whether her career was real. She told him about the rosemary plant she had set on the windowsill herself. She told him about tonight, about Rosalind Fleet, and the word "permanent" from Charlotte's careful mouth. When she finished, Lord Beaumont was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see." And Daniel was at the other end of the room. Another pause. "All right," Henry said. "I think it is time. I'll make some calls." "Henry, I don't want it to be." "I know," he said. "I'll be careful. But Sophie, my darling girl, there's a limit to patience, and you've exceeded it by approximately 2.5 years. Go back inside. Don't let them see they've affected you." She went back inside. She poured herself a glass of water, returned to the table, and spent the rest of the evening being warm and engaged, and exactly as she always was. If Rosalind Fleet or Charlotte Ashford noticed anything different about her, it was only that she seemed, somehow, slightly more at ease than before. In the 2 months that followed, nothing appeared to change at the Ashford estate. Spring arrived. The oak trees along the driveway came into leaf. Daniel talked about a holiday. Patricia floated the idea of a family reunion in the summer and sent the initial emails to Charlotte and Robert without mentioning Sophie. But in London and in other places, things were very much in motion. Lord Henry Beaumont had, as promised, made some calls. The first was to a woman named Dr. Fiona Harcastle, the Director of Collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Fiona had known Henry for 20 years through various cultural board positions, and she had been, for the past 18 months, quietly aware that Sophie Brennan was one of the most talented textile conservators of her generation. She knew this because 2 independent consultants had told her so after Sophie's work on a 16th century Flemish tapestry had been published in the museum's own journal. Fiona had been looking for a lead conservator for a new project, a significant one, involving a collection of royal textiles that had been in storage for decades. She had already had Sophie in mind. Lord Beaumont's call simply accelerated the decision. Sophie received a letter from the V&A in late March. She read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, made a cup of tea, and read it again. The position was a senior lead conservator role, overseeing a project that would span 4 years and involve collaboration with the Royal Collection Trust. The salary was almost double what she currently earned through freelance contracts. The letter was signed by Fiona Harcastle and, beneath it, by a second name, Sir Alistair Pemberton, chairman of the Royal Collection Trust, and a man whose institutional influence Sophie understood to be, to put it conservatively, considerable. Sir Alistair Pemberton, it should be noted, was Lord Henry Beaumont's oldest friend. Sophie accepted the position quietly. She told Daniel, who was genuinely pleased. She told him she'd need to spend 3 days a week in London from September. He said he could adjust his own schedule. She did not tell the Ashford family. Not yet. The second call Lord Beaumont made was to a woman named Cecily Ward, a journalist at a publication that specialized in cultural and heritage affairs. He did not give Cecily a story. He did not ask her to write anything. He simply mentioned, in the context of a broader conversation about the V&A's upcoming Royal Textile project, that the newly appointed lead conservator was a young Irish woman who had studied under Margaretha Vonk in Amsterdam, and whose work on the Flemish tapestry collection had been described in specialist circles as once in a generation. He mentioned her name. He mentioned it once, casually, and moved on. Cecily Ward, who was very good at her job. Filed the name. The third call Lord Beaumont made was the one that would matter most. It was private, and it was brief, and it was to an office in a building that Sophie had visited only twice in her life, once at 17, when her mother brought her to a formal reception, and once at 24, when she attended a private lunch in her own right. It was not an office with a plaque on the door, or a building that appeared on tourist maps. What came from that call did not arrive immediately. These things never do, but it was set in motion, like a stone dropped in deep, still water. The Ashford family reunion was held in late July 2022 at the estate. 43 people, a marquee on the rear lawn, a catered lunch that stretched into an evening. Daniel had confirmed Sophie's attendance to Patricia in April. Patricia had said, "Of course," in a tone that conveyed the opposite. By July, something had shifted in the ambient climate of the estate. Sophie couldn't quite identify it, a slight adjustment in how certain people spoke to her, a slightly longer pause before the usual condescensions. Even Charlotte, at a family dinner in June, had paused before deploying sweet and then chosen a different word. Patricia had, for the first time, asked Sophie about her work, genuinely asked, or something approximating it. Sophie noticed these changes the way a weather forecaster notices a shift in pressure. She didn't remark on them. She simply adjusted. What she didn't know, what none of the Ashfords knew, was that Cecily Ward's piece had been published in early June. It was a long-form profile of the V&A's Royal Textile Project, and in its third paragraph, it described Sophie Brennan as the most significant appointment in British textile conservation in a decade, and noted that her selection had been made with input from the highest institutional levels. The piece ran with a photograph of Sophie at work in the conservation studio, taken with her permission. She looked, in the photograph, exactly as she was precise, focused, completely in her element. The piece had been picked up by 3 national newspapers. Charlotte Ashford had read it in the Saturday supplement of The Guardian. Robert Ashford had seen a reference to it in a newsletter he received from a cultural foundation he sat on. Patricia had not yet seen it, but her friend Diane Hargreaves had, and Diane had sent Patricia a text message that said, "Only Patricia. Have you seen this piece about Sophie in the Guardian supplement? Call me." But the piece was not the main event. It was the introduction. The main event arrived in the last week of July, 4 days before the family reunion, in the form of a cream-colored envelope delivered by hand to the Ashford estate's front door. Patricia Ashford received the envelope from the housekeeper and opened it in her sitting room with her reading glasses on. Inside was a letter 1 page, handwritten on heavy paper with a crest at the top that Patricia had seen on other correspondence before, on invitations and formal notices, and which made her sit down slowly in her armchair. The letter was short. It expressed warm personal regards for Miss Sophie Brennan, noted a long-standing interest in Miss Brennan's professional and personal well-being, conveyed a particular appreciation for the work she had undertaken with the Royal Collection Trust project, and concluded with a sentence that Patricia read 3 times before she fully understood it. It was signed, at the bottom, with a name that made Patricia's hands go slightly unsteady. She sat with the letter for 20 minutes. Then she called Charlotte. "Charlotte," she said, "come to the house. Now." "Mum, I'm in the middle of now. Charlotte." Charlotte arrived in 1 hour and 40 minutes. Patricia met her in the hall and handed her the envelope without a word. Charlotte read the letter in the doorway of the sitting room. Then she looked at her mother. "How long?" Charlotte said carefully. "Has she known this person?" "I have no idea," Patricia said. "I have no idea. We never asked." The silence between them was very long. "She never mentioned it," Charlotte said. "No," Patricia said. "She didn't." The morning of the reunion, Sophie came downstairs to find the house unusually still. The catering team was setting up in the garden, the folding tables arranged in the marquee, the white linen bright in the morning sun. But inside the house itself, something was different. She felt it before she could name it. Patricia was in the kitchen when Sophie came in. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that Patricia looked up immediately, with a directness Sophie had not often seen from her, and said, "Good morning. Sophie, there's fresh coffee. Sit down, if you have a moment." Sophie sat down. Patricia poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Sophie and sat across from her at the kitchen table. and for a moment she seemed to be gathering herself in the way of a person preparing to say something that requires more courage than they'd expected. "I received a letter this week," Patricia said. "Oh," Sophie said. "From Lord Beaumont." Something moved across Sophie's face, not surprise, but something quieter, a kind of steadiness. "He mentioned he'd written." Patricia looked at her steadily. "You know Henry Beaumont." "He's my godfather," Sophie said simply. "He was my mother's oldest friend. He's looked after me since she died." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the catering staff called out to another about the placement of chairs. "You never mentioned it," Patricia said. "Not once. In 3 years." "It never came up," Sophie said. "I don't tend to lead with who I know. It's not how I was raised." Patricia was quiet again. Sophie could see something working behind her eyes. Not calculation, exactly, but a reckoning. The particular discomfort of a woman who prided herself on judgment coming to terms with the evidence of its failure. The letter was very... Patricia began. "I know what it said," Sophie said gently. "Henry tells me what he's doing. He told me he wrote. He asked my permission. And you gave it." "Yes." Sophie set down her coffee cup. "Because 3 years is long enough. Patricia, and that dinner in February was long enough." Patricia said nothing. "I'm not angry with you," Sophie said. And this was the remarkable thing, because it was true. "I want you to know that. I understand that you had an idea about what was right for your son, and I didn't fit it. I understand family loyalty. I have my own version of it." She paused. "But I'm not nobody. I never was. I was just quiet about it, because I didn't think you should need to know about Lord Beaumont or the V&A or any of it to treat me with ordinary decency." The word landed in the room. Decency. Patricia didn't flinch from it, which Sophie found she respected. "No," Patricia said finally. "You shouldn't have." The family began arriving at 11 o'clock. By noon, 38 of the 43 expected guests were on the lawn, drinks in hand, children running between the marquee supports. The older relatives arranged in comfortable chairs near the shade. Daniel moved through the gathering with the ease of a man in his natural habitat, occasionally touching Sophie's shoulder as he passed her. Charlotte arrived and found Sophie in conversation with Daniel's cousin, Edward Ashford, a quiet architect who had always been pleasant to Sophie and who was laughing at something she'd said about the structural instability of the Beauvais Cathedral tapestry collection. Charlotte stopped a few feet away. She looked at Sophie differently than she ever had before. Not with warmth, exactly, but with the particular adjustment of a person recalibrating. "Sophie," she said. "Charlotte." Sophie smiled at her without defensiveness. "I read the Guardian piece," Charlotte said. "Last month." I should have said something earlier. "You don't have to. I read it, and I thought," Charlotte continued, with the halting honesty of someone not practiced in it, "that I had perhaps been quite unfair to you, in various ways." She stopped. "For quite a long time." Sophie looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You were..." Charlotte blinked. "But I don't think you're a bad person." Sophie added, "I think you were protecting something. Your family, your mother, your sense of how things should be. People do strange things for those reasons. I know that." She let the pause sit for a moment. "I just prefer you didn't do them to me anymore," Charlotte said. "Yes. All right." It was not a dramatic scene. It didn't have to be. Some reckonings are quiet. The afternoon shifted further at around 2 o'clock, when a car arrived at the end of the drive that nobody recognized, a dark blue Jaguar, driven by a man in a dark suit. It came slowly up the gravel, parked near the house, and from it stepped Lord Henry Beaumont. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the temperature and stakes were very high. He wore a linen suit and carried a walking stick he used only occasionally. He did not look like a man who arrived anywhere to make a point. He looked like a man who arrived everywhere as a matter of course. He had not been invited. He had not told Sophie he was coming. He had simply driven from London because, as he would explain later, he wanted to meet the family face to face. He was 71 years old and had no patience left for proxy. Sophie saw him from across the lawn and felt something release in her chest. Some held breath she hadn't known she was holding. She went to him. He took her hand in both of his and kissed her cheek and said, quietly, "How are you?" "Better," she said. "Much better." "Good." Patricia Ashford, who had been watching from the edge of the lawn, came forward. She crossed the grass with her chin up and her hand extended, and Lord Henry Beaumont shook it and said, "Mrs. Ashford, thank you for having me." "Of course," Patricia said, and then, in a lower voice that Sophie could barely hear, "I owe your goddaughter an apology." Henry looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I think you do, but more importantly, so do you." Daniel, who had been standing nearby and who had heard enough of this to piece together the shape of what was happening, came to stand beside Sophie. He put his arm around her and said, in her ear, "How long have you known Henry Beaumont?" "Since before I could walk," Sophie said. "And you never asked about my godfather," she said. "Your family never asked about my family at all. There's a lesson there, if you want it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. Then, "Sophie, I'm genuinely sorry. For all of it. I saw what they did, and I looked the other way, and it was wrong. It was cowardly." "Yes," she said. "It was—" She didn't soften it. She didn't tell him it was fine. Some things aren't fine, and saying so isn't cruelty, it's just honesty. "I'd like to do better," he said. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't believe that." Across the lawn, Lord Beaumont had been absorbed into a conversation with Robert Ashford, who had recognized him within 30 seconds of introduction and was now speaking to him with an entirely different quality of attention than he had ever extended to Sophie. Robert Ashford, who had once asked her whether she had been at the gallery opening as a guest, was now leaning forward with the alert posture of a man eager to make a good impression. Sophie watched this and felt not triumph, exactly, but something like clarity. The way you feel when a word you've been trying to remember finally surfaces. The afternoon went on. The lunch was served. The speeches were given. The children ran until they were tired and then sat in the grass. The evening came in slow and golden over the old oak trees. At some point after 7, when the catering team was packing up and the guests were beginning to drift toward their cars, Rosalind Fleet, who had attended and who had spent most of the day carefully not looking at Sophie, found herself briefly alone with her on the terrace. Rosalind held her glass and looked at her. "I said something dreadful to you in February," Rosalind said. "At Patricia's birthday." "You did," Sophie agreed. "I don't have an excuse." "No," Sophie said. "You don't?" Rosalind Fleet had been expecting graciousness, the magnanimous acceptance of apology. What she got was something more, uncomfortable simple, unadorned agreement. It required her to sit with the weight of what she'd said without the lightening that forgiveness would have provided. "Right," Rosalind said. "Yes. Well." She went inside shortly afterward. Daniel found Sophie on the terrace later, just the two of them in the dark, the last of the warm air settling around the garden. "What happens now?" he asked. "I started the V&A in September," she said. "I'll need 3 days a week in London." "I know. And I think," she said, "that things need to be clearer. Between us, about what this is and what we want from it." He was quiet. "I love you," she said. "I've always loved you. But I'm not willing to be treated the way I've been treated in this house. And I can't be with someone who watches that happen and doesn't speak." "I hear you," he said. "I mean that. I know you do." She turned to look at him. "So I suppose we find out if that's enough." It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something more honest than that, a reckoning and an opening. The kind you have to earn. In the months that followed the reunion, things reorganized themselves with the particular efficiency of things that have been waiting a long time to settle. But it would be wrong to suggest the settling was clean or comfortable. Reckonings rarely are. What happened in the Ashford family after that July afternoon was not a smooth correction. It was a series of small collisions, quiet reversals, and moments of painful honesty that arrived in their own time, at their own pace, and left marks on everyone involved. Sophie's work at the V&A began in September, and from her first week in the conservation studio, it was clear to everyone around her that the appointment had not been a favour. It had been a recognition. The Royal Textile Project, a collection of Jacobean embroideries, several Stuart-era bed hangings, and a series of early Georgian dress silks that had spent 40 years in storage at Hampton Court, wrapped in acid-free tissue and largely forgotten, was precisely the kind of work Sophie had trained for across a decade of disciplined, painstaking practice. She arrived each morning before 8 and was often still at her bench when the building's security team began their evening rounds. She brought to the work a quality her colleagues would later describe in various ways. One said precision. One said reverence. One said something closer to obsession. But what they all meant was the same thing. She cared with a depth that was almost physical, and it showed in every decision she made. Doctor. Fiona Harcastle sent Lord Beaumont a brief note in November. It said only, "You were right about her." She is extraordinary. Henry Beaumont read it at his desk, folded it into thirds, and placed it in a drawer where he kept things worth keeping. Sir Alistair Pemberton visited the studio in October, accompanied by 2 members of the Royal Collection Trust. He was not a demonstrative man. His professional vocabulary ran to acceptable and satisfactory the way other men's ran to superlatives, but he spent over an hour with Sophie that afternoon, examining the condition reports, asking careful questions about her intervention philosophy, listening with the focused attention of someone taking genuine stock. When he left, he paused at the studio door and said, "Remarkable stewardship." Miss Brennan. For Alistair Pemberton, that was a standing ovation. The piece Cecily Ward had published in the spring was followed in October by a longer profile in a heritage and culture magazine, a full feature. Several thousand words, accompanied by photographs of Sophie at work that managed to capture something the written description alone couldn't quite reach the quality of attention she brought to what she did. the way she seemed to slow down time around an object. The piece was titled, with a romanticism Sophie found slightly mortifying, "The Woman Who Saves What Time Has Almost Lost." It was read by approximately 340,000 people. It was shared extensively in professional circles, but also more broadly the kind of piece that travels beyond its intended audience because it touches something recognizable. Something about a person who works quietly and well, without noise or performance, in service of things that matter. Charlotte Ashford sent Sophie a text message the day the article went live. It said, "This is wonderful. You must be so proud. The photographs are beautiful. See." Sophie read it on the train back from London and sat with it for a moment, turning it over in her mind. It was more warmth than Charlotte had extended in 3 years of shared family occasions. It was not nothing. Sophie replied with a simple "thank you" and a single line about how the photography team had been generous, and Charlotte responded with a small heart emoji, which was. Sophie thought, perhaps the most revealing thing Charlotte Ashford had ever communicated. The armour, when it finally came down, turned out to be surprisingly thin. Patricia Ashford didn't send a message about the article. Sophie hadn't expected her to, and didn't hold the absence against her. Patricia was a woman of formal gestures, not spontaneous ones, and spontaneity in the wrong direction would have felt dishonest from both sides. What Patricia did instead was something Sophie found more significant. She called her. Not texted, called. On a Wednesday morning in November, while Sophie was between meetings at the V&A, her phone rang, and the name on the screen was Patricia Ashford, and Sophie stepped into the corridor and answered. Patricia said she'd been given the name of a conservator through a gallery contact for a piece of embroidery that had been in the family for 3 generations, a late Victorian piece. A panel of crewel work depicting a pastoral scene that had begun to deteriorate along one edge where it had been stored near a radiator for years. She said she didn't know quite who to trust with it. She said she wondered whether Sophie might have a recommendation. Her voice was measured and careful, as it always was. But there was something underneath the measured quality that Sophie recognized the particular tone of someone who has chosen a pretext because they need to make contact, but haven't yet found the courage to say what they actually mean. Sophie made the recommendation, a conservator she trusted entirely, a woman named Bridget Farr, who had trained alongside her in Amsterdam and now ran her own studio in Bath. She gave Patricia the name and the contact details and explained what to tell Bridget about the piece and how to properly document its condition before transport. Patricia said, "Thank you." She paused. Then she said, "You really do love this work, don't you?" It was phrased as a statement, not a question. Sophie understood that it was an apology wearing different clothing. "More than almost anything," Sophie said. The call lasted 11 minutes. It was the longest and most honest conversation they had ever had. It was not the beginning of friendship. Patricia Ashford was not a woman who would ever be entirely comfortable with what she had done, or with the discomfort of revising her judgment so substantially. But it was the beginning of something that might, in time, become mutual respect. Sophie thought that was probably all she had ever wanted from her. Robert Ashford was a different matter, and his reckoning came in a form that gave Sophie a private, quiet satisfaction she elected not to examine too closely. In October, he had arranged through a mutual acquaintance to attend a dinner at Lord Beaumont's home in Chelsea, apparently without knowing that Sophie would also be present. It was a small gathering, 8 people, around a long table in Henry's dining room, which smelled of old books and wood smoke and the particular combination of things that had been carefully chosen over a lifetime. When Robert arrived and found Sophie in the sitting room, a glass of wine in hand, laughing at something Henry had said, his face went through 3 or 4 distinct expressions in rapid succession, none of them graceful. Sophie watched this happen and felt something that wasn't quite triumph, more like recognition, the particular feeling of seeing something finally named. "Sophie," he said. "Robert," she said. "Can I get you something to drink?" She poured him a glass of Burgundy. They spoke for 20 minutes over the course of the evening about his work on a cultural foundation board, about the textile project, about a woman they both knew from the London arts world named Frances Gould, whose gallery had recently relocated to Shoreditch. It was civilized and even, at moments, genuinely pleasant. Robert was intelligent and, when he chose to be, engaging. Sophie had always known this. What had been missing on every previous occasion was his willingness to direct any of that intelligence and engagement toward her, to extend to her the quality of attention he reserved for people he considered worth it. He extended it now. She noticed, and she accepted it without comment, which was, she felt, the most gracious way to handle it. Some corrections don't need to be named aloud to be understood. When Robert left that evening, he told Lord Beaumont it had been a splendid occasion, and that he hoped to see him at the Foundation Symposium in January. Henry said he was looking forward to it, and wished him a safe drive home. When the door closed and Henry returned to the sitting room, he found Sophie by the fireplace with an expression he recognized. "You're trying not to look pleased," he said. "I'm succeeding, I think," she said. "Admirably," he agreed, and refilled both their glasses. The Ashford dynamic, after all of this, was neither resolved nor ruined. It was adjusted, imperfectly, the way most things are adjusted after a reckoning that nobody saw coming with some pride swallowed, some truths left only half said, some awkwardness that might eventually wear smooth with time. Charlotte was making an effort that was visible and, Sophie believed, genuine. Patricia was moving slowly towards something she didn't have words for yet. Geoffrey Crane had shaken Sophie's hand at a family dinner in November, with a different quality of pressure, not the firm, proprietary handshake of a man performing importance, but the grip of someone acknowledging they have underestimated. These were small things. Sophie had always been good at noticing small things. Daniel was doing what he had promised to do, which was trying, and to his credit, trying with more consistency than Sophie had dared hope for in the beginning. He had spoken to his mother in October, not a confrontation, but a long, uncomfortable conversation in which he'd said plainly that he had seen what had been happening for 3 years and had failed to name it, and that he would not be in that position again. Patricia had listened. She had been stiff and reluctant and, at the end, quietly honest in the way of a person unaccustomed to being held accountable by their children. She said she had perhaps misjudged certain things. She did not say Sophie's name, but they both understood who she meant. Daniel told Sophie about the conversation that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea going cold between them. He told it carefully and plainly, without embellishment. And when he was done, he said, "I should have done that 18 months ago, at least." "Yes," Sophie said, "you should have." She didn't soften it. She had decided some time ago that softening it would be a disservice to both of them. He needed to know the weight of what had been left unnamed, needed to sit with it rather than have it reduced to something manageable and already forgiven. That was not cruelty. That was the only way for the repair to be real. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend it's fine." "Good," she said, because it wasn't. They sat with that for a while. Outside, the autumn was pulling the last of the leaves from the oak trees along the drive. The kitchen was warm. The rosemary plant on the step was still alive, smaller now against the cold, but persistent. "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked. "Going forward? What do you actually need?" Sophie thought about this not performatively, not as a precursor to a list of demands, but as a genuine question being answered genuinely. "I need you to see things when they happen," she said. "I don't need you to make scenes. I'm not asking you to go to war with your family. I'm just asking you to see what's in front of you and say so. That's all I've ever wanted from you." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." "I know you can," she said. "I watched you tonight. You already did." He looked up at her. "The way you spoke to Robert at the dinner last week," she said. "When he made that remark about independent women having complicated ideas, you said something, you didn't let it sit. That mattered." "It wasn't much," he said. "It was something," she said. "Something is where it starts." The tea was cold by then, and neither of them moved to warm it. The kitchen was quiet around them in the way of a house that has had hard things said in it recently and is settling back into its own structure. It was not a perfect evening, but it was an honest one. And between the two of them, honesty had always been the thing that mattered most, the thing that had drawn them to each other in the first place, before families and history and pride had made everything so complicated. Outside, the rosemary held on. The oaks stood bare and enormous in the dark. Inside, two people sat with their cold tea and their complicated love and the particular, fragile courage of people who are choosing again. To try. It's almost a year now since the family reunion. Sophie Brennan is still at the V&A, and the Royal Textile Project has been extended by an additional year following consultations with the Royal Collection Trust. She was asked, in early spring, to present at a conservation symposium in Vienna, not as a junior attendee, not as a research assistant, but as the keynote speaker. She and Daniel Ashford are still together. He has been doing what he said he would do, trying slowly, consistently, and with the particular courage of a person who has had to admit they were wrong about something very close to them. He spoke to his mother, honestly. Finally, in October, not a dramatic confrontation, but a careful, direct conversation in which he said that he had seen things he should have named and hadn't, and that he would not watch it happen again. Patricia had listened. She had said, with a stiffness that was also a kind of honesty, "I may have been hasty in my judgment." It was not, in the language of the Ashford family, an insignificant admission. They are not yet engaged. They have talked about it. Sophie has said that when it happens, if it happens, she wants it to happen, because they have chosen each other clearly and entirely, not because time has accumulated, not because a family finally approves, not because it's expected. She has a ring from her mother, a small garnet in a gold setting, worn thin at the band from years on Oif Brennan's hand that she wears on her right hand, and has since she was 22. She doesn't talk about it much. The people who need to understand it. Lord Henry Beaumont came to her Vienna keynote. He sat in the third row and listened to her speak for 40 minutes about the ethics of intervention in historical textiles, about the paradox of conservation, which is that to save something you must also, always, touch it. And when she was finished, and the room was applauding, she caught his eye, and he gave her the smallest nod. The rosemary plant from that first October evening is still alive. It grew too large for the windowsill within a year, and Sophie repotted it into a terracotta pot that now sits on the kitchen step at the Wiltshire estate. It has survived 3 winters. Patricia Ashford walked past it every day for 6 months before she stopped one morning and actually looked at it. She stood there for a moment. Then she went inside without saying anything, but she didn't move it. That, Sophie thought, was probably something. That, in the language of complicated families and long patience, and people slowly becoming less small than they have been, was probably something indeed. She never announced who she was. She never dropped names at dinner tables to buy herself safety. She just kept showing up, doing the work, and trusting that the truth about a person, if it's real, survives everything that's thrown against it. And in the end, it did. The family that tried to make her feel like nothing discovered she was protected by something they couldn't dismiss, couldn't outrank, and couldn't undo. But more than that, they discovered that they had spent 3 years treating a remarkable woman like she was invisible. And the shame of that had nothing to do with Lord Beaumont, the V&A, or royal authority. It had to do with who they had chosen to be. If this story hit something true for you, if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by people who never bothered to look, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below about a time you were misjudged and how it turned out. Hit that like button if Sophie's patience reminded you of your own, and subscribe because we tell real stories about real people every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.